Keir Starmer has removed his chief of staff. 60% of voters think Labour is sleazy. The first 100 days of this government is turning into one of the worst you and I can remember, Kamal. And I'm not taking too much delight in it,
I can hear
honestly.
the laughter in your voice.
On the back of this loveless landslide majority for Labour.
Yes, public service has turned into a little bit of a public shambles. We'll be revealing what actually happened to Sue Gray, why it matters, and what next for the beleaguered Prime Minister.
And on the anniversary of the October the 7th terrorist attack on Israel, which saw 1,200 people murdered, we'll have moving testimony from those affected, including one man's heart-rending story of being reunited with his kidnapped wife and their 3 young children.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey. So, Kamal, I'm back in the studio.
Lovely to have you back, Camilla.
This is nice.
The podcast marriage. We've had some moments together, haven't we? But we're back.
We're back in earnest. And so I had just finished interviewing Boris Johnson and putting that all together.
Can I just say, Camilla, we talked about this on Friday. It was lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
What an excellent interview it was.
Kamal.
No, but I think for a number of reasons. A, the way that we interview on this podcast as well, let that person speak and reveal themselves. And you get so much more by doing things at length. I thought what was really interesting was that you had commentary through it, but also he spoke for a long time, and you could really feel what Boris Johnson wanted to get out about the future of the Tories, COVID, international relations, etc.
That's very kind of you. Obviously, there was some dissent on social media suggesting I had interrupted him too much. You can't ever win. You know, you cannot let Boris Johnson just ramble on for 15 minutes. Famously, the BBC's Nick Robinson actually got so frustrated with him during an interview, he actually told him on air to shut up. We didn't get to that point, but I had to keep on reeling him in. I said he was harder to pin down than jelly. But I thought we got quite a lot out of him. And he was in a very ebullient mood. It was an interesting, if exhausting, experience altogether. And then Sunday got even more exhausting, Kamal, because I'm just coming off air. I was doing a little segment on Jewish food that is eaten at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I had quite a large piece of bread in my mouth, and the producer says in my ear, Sue Gray's gone. I initially thought, gone where? So I then have to turn to the camera, just gnawing on this loaf, saying, right, we've got some breaking news. Sue Gray, Chief of Staff, has gone from Downing Street. I shall be bringing you more in just a moment. Once I've just swallowed this food, this is the light and shade of television, Kamal, that you'll be very familiar with. So that kind of overtook the news agenda on Sunday, didn't it?
This has been something that's been coming for a while. Do you remember the moment, Ben Riley-Smith wrote about this in The Telegraph today, our political editor, that at Labour Party conference, one person was very visible, Morgan McSweeney, the former campaign director for the Labour Party before the election, and one person was very invisible, Sue Gray. So there was Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, having a very obvious lunch or dinner with Morgan McSweeney, who's now become the Chief of Staff at Labour Party conference, in a place where everyone could see them together, the two of them, almost anointing the new king, the prince across the water, Morgan McSweeney. And Sue Gray very obviously wasn't visible because of all the rows over freebies, over the lack of control, over the lack of a plan for when this government came into place. And all that came to pass with the announcement yesterday at lunchtime. Clearly, by the time of Labour Party conference 2 weeks ago, Keir Starmer had already made the decision that Sue Gray couldn't carry on. I think one of the most toxic moments for Sue Gray, this is the woman who was formerly head of ethics for the civil service. She was the woman you went to get the judgement on whether you had done right or wrong. Was the weekend of Labour Party conference when she was pictured with David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and Keir Starmer in the director's box at a match at Spurs. And you wonder to yourself, OK, Keir Starmer's made a pretty thin attempt at defending why he has to go in director's box because of security and it'd be more expensive for him to sit in the stands, and he's a long-term fan. None of those things, to my knowledge, are true of Sue Gray. But there she was in her wraparound sunglasses, sitting in the director's box, accepting a ticket from that football club or the Premier League. I don't
Yes.
know which. And I thought at that point, that ship has sailed for her.
But on ethics, just rewind a bit and think back to her presiding over the Partygate inquiry, because there's a link. Yesterday there was a clear link between me speaking to Johnson about Sue Gray and then suddenly she's gone. And if you are a head of ethics, do you take on the role of being the inquisitor into Partygate and Boris Johnson if deep down you have eyes on a bigger prize, and that is to work with Keir Starmer in a future administration? And I say that because Starmer was repeatedly asked, when did your conversations with Sue Gray begin? And he was not able to deny that approaches had been made before she landed that Partygate role. So ethically, if you want to be whiter than white, as the expression goes, don't you say to yourself, this is going to put me in such a difficult position if I carry out the Partygate inquiry and then I go and work for Labour, not least because she must have had in the back of her mind her own son, Liam Conlon's political ambitions. He's now the Labour MP for Beckenham. He's now the Labour MP for Beckenham and Penge. But the whole thing smacks of, well, you're a lefty.
Well, and also supported by Wahid Ali, of course.
Supported by Wahid Ali with 10
who got into all those
grand.
problems. It's amazing, isn't it, Camilla, where when things unravel, you think to yourself, didn't anyone think this is not going to work, this is not going to look good? And it shows the difficulty of civil servants moving into political roles, because it wasn't only the conversations she may or may not have had with Keir Starmer, but apparently those conversations started actually with Ed Miliband many years earlier.
Yes.
And she clearly is somebody who had been looking at the possibility of a political role where you can wield more power, because I was speaking to senior Whitehall sources this morning about this. Civil servants give you a range of options and arguments for a range of options. They don't decide things. They tell you, here are the different options and here are the arguments for the different options. Whereas if you become chief of staff, you make decisions. I was told, though, that Keir Starmer should have known. This is about Keir Starmer's judgment. Sue Gray was not political. She didn't do policy. She did probity.
Yes.
She looked at things where there was a decision to be made on whether someone had done something wrong. So I think Keir Starmer, if we step right back, this is not really about a row between Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney, which probably not, well, Sue Gray they've heard of now, but not that many people will have known 6 months ago. This is about the Prime Minister's judgment, about it was already clear that Labour were going to win. We've known that for a year in the polls, or really since the end of Liz Truss. How do you prepare for government shows you the mark of what type of government you're going to be. The fact is, Sue Gray, oddly, given her lack of experience in policy, was put in charge of the grid. The grid is how a government handles its own announcements.
Yes.
And it's been reported today by us and others that she was in charge of the 100-day grid. How is the government going to land for if and when it won the election? Well, clearly, Camilla, you and I have seen over the past 97 days, I think it is now, of this government, that it has landed very badly, from the winter fuel allowance, from the rows about VAT on private schools, the freebies, Donorgate, the vacuum of any other matters of substance, the delay in the budget.
Releasing prisoners early.
You know, lots and lots of issues, and then the issues around arms embargo to Israel. We're going to talk about Israel a little bit later. Clearly, there was no coherent plan to set a narrative for this government, which is so necessary in the first 100 days of government. I tweeted yesterday and got into probably a similar argument that you did over the Boris Johnson interview. I tweeted yesterday that this was one of the worst starts to a government I could remember in my career. And that goes right back to the first one in work that I remember was John Major, 1992. But the first election I covered was 1997. And lots of people said, oh, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak. Fine. But when you knew you were heading for a huge majority, when you could plan for that, and you still had such problems when you arrived in government and didn't seem to know politically what you were doing, that does make this one of the worst starts in politics for a new government with, as you say, a big but loveless majority that I can remember in my career in politics,
So we have
political journalism.
No, that's right. But we also have this bizarre meeting of two unpolitical minds, because you're saying about her being in charge of the grid. The person that's normally in charge of the grid has a huge policy focus, but also is media savvy. We since find out that Sue Gray has referred to journalists as scumbags. So she doesn't even seem to understand the media landscape and how best to land policy, which is that is an integral part of the grid. We then have a lack of political nous in Keir Starmer, as you say, in even deciding that he should appoint her. Again, reflecting on Johnson, Johnson said, I regret appointing her to be the Partygate inquisitor. Having said that, the report that she actually produced wasn't too damning. It could have been a lot worse for Boris Johnson.
I think it's a little bit, well, I don't know whether it was vindictive. I think it's super naive. I think Starmer thought this gave him authority. It gave him something he could throw back. Look at the talent of the people I am hiring, because most of the other people who have gone into government with him have no government knowledge. And he thought that that cauterized that attack. You've got no government knowledge. You won't know what you're doing. The big problem, I think, for Labour is that they have found it very hard to change gear, which you need to do hugely between opposition and government. And they are still using the language and attack of being in opposition when they are in government. And that is not what the public want from government. They want government to be for all the people. And I think we're going to come on to a couple of tweets that we saw over the weekend, which irritated both of us. One other thing I was told by the people I spoke to this morning, there's actually three people in this marriage, so to speak. You've got Morgan McSweeney, who I think everyone who speaks about it is talented. He's a political campaigner, certainly talented at campaigns. Whether he's talented at the policy of government, we will now start seeing. Sue Gray, of course, the former chief of staff, who's been given this rather odd non-job of envoy to the nations and regions. I mean, an envoy usually goes abroad. I don't know that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are abroad.
But it's just a nod to her Northern Irish roots, isn't it?
Could it be part-time? And also, why hasn't the government answered very simple questions on what's she going to be paid and is she going to get a peerage? Again, they're letting the story drift on because they can't answer the most simple of questions today. But the third person in this marriage is Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. Simon Case, according to people I have spoken to, hasn't allowed. Simon Case hasn't gripped this issue. He should be advising Keir Starmer really clearly on what he should do, and they should be locking it down really rapidly.
He's mob happy though.
Well, he's leaving at the start of the new year in 2025, but it seems to be the three of them have been caught in this infighting. There was clearly a lot of upset amongst Labour officials who went into government and suddenly realised they were going to be paid less, not just less than Sue Gray, who's being paid more than the Prime Minister, but less than they were being paid in opposition when they were in Labour. I was hearing yesterday, as I was asking around about this story, that there was a huge amount of acrimony because she still hadn't signed off some of the SPAD, the Special Advisor contracts. So they've been working and aren't sure what they're being paid at all. It doesn't strike me as particularly sort of workers' rights friendly, Kamal. I think, again, not something that Sue Gray would really know how to do. Yeah, but it's an interesting correlation again. I'm sorry, I seem to be obsessed with bringing this back to Johnson, but there's so many echoes of Dominic Cummings here. Okay, there's an echo of somebody who was a good campaigner but couldn't actually run anything. He also wanted full control over the SPADs. Do you remember those rows that he had with Sajid Javid, which forced Sajid Javid out of the Treasury as Chancellor because Dominic Cummings went over his head and tried to sack a SPAD that he didn't think agreed with the overall macro policy. There's also these repeated tales about Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney vying for the Prime Minister's ear. Sue Gray has apparently moved McSweeney's desk further away from the Prime Minister's. That has been denied, but yes, it's got out. It's been leaked still, it shows. So reminiscent of Dominic Cummings, who was also literally apparently moving around furniture to make sure that he was in Boris Johnson's eyesight first. And then it comes down to the same thing, as you say, Kamal, a sort of lack of general oversight. And also there is two advisors here that become the story because they are characters. You know, Dominic Cummings, quite formidable, once described as
once described by David Cameron as a career psychopath. And then Sue Gray has got this aura about her, you know, like she's a bit scary, like nobody wants to cross Sue Gray. I told you I saw this in Downing Street. Sue Gray was ushered in to the crowd as Keir Starmer and his wife Victoria came into Downing Street for the first time. It was like the parting of the waves. Moses had arrived. So
at least Dominic Cummings tried to do policy. What's been happening inside Number 10, and again, some of this has to rest at the door of Simon Case and the vacuum there. So Keir Starmer now needs to decide who is going to be the next cabinet secretary. How long is that going to rumble on for? That job is so key because if you don't know how government works, your cabinet secretary is one of the most important people that you have. And Keir Starmer has also tried to improve his communication because when you get into government, you need to say what you're doing. You need to say why you're doing it, and you need to repeat it endlessly. You need to feed the beast of the media, the beast of social media, that voters want to hear from you. You need to have a process for constantly communicating. And I think one of the defences that was put out today was that, but Parliament's only been sitting for 20 days in the first 100 days because of, summer recess, etc. Sort of, so what?
Yeah.
You still need to be out there making decisions and making the arguments about what you're doing. And I just do want to come to Bridget Phillipson. This tweet. I want to come to it because I think it is very connected to what we're seeing here, this lack of grip at the centre. I could not have imagined, as I say, I covered 1997 election, and obviously I dealt a lot with Alastair Campbell. Now, there's lots of criticisms of Alastair Campbell, but boy, you knew what the government was trying to do.
Yes.
Now, and he would shout down the phone or in your face about what the government was doing to make it clear. Of course, some of those behaviours were inappropriate with some journalists, never with me, but it was clear. I cannot imagine that Alastair Campbell would ever have stood, it would have been a letter, of course, in those days, but any of his MPs or any ministers writing this. This is what Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, tweeted, I think it was on Saturday, and she said, and this was about the VAT on private schools. She said, our state schools need teachers more than private schools need embossed stationery. Our children need mental health support more than private schools need new pools. Our students need careers advice more than private schools need AstroTurf pitches.
This is so...
Now,
it's just
that
appalling.
tone with that whiff of class war, soak the rich, is not the way that a Secretary of State for Education should, frankly, approach her job. She is here now for all voters. What did Keir Starmer say?
I'm here for
First
everyone.
days, I'm here for everyone. And this tone, which is about motivating your base, you have to leave that at the door of opposition. Yes, when you're in opposition, Angela Rayner, the Tories are scum, you're motivating your base. We get it. When you're in the cabinet and you're looking after schools, and that is your job, and lots of people go to private schools, and you're not closing private schools. You've not made the big bet that you're going to shut them. So if that is happening, then you need to be for everyone.
We've been inundated, haven't we, with correspondence from concerned parents. All this tweet does is alienate really hard-working people. Newsflash, not everybody that sends their child to a private school is driving a Maserati, and it's driving a Maserati and having endless holidays in the Maldives. Most people are in a couple that are both working really hard and holidaying in the UK to make up for it. So I totally agree with you, that total sense of alienation. But, you've written a great column for today. I wrote a column at the weekend, this government of service. Who is this government of service serving? It's a government right now of self-service. This is the kind of language Phillipson has employed here. And this is a really educated woman who, by the way, benefited from social mobility under a Conservative government to be working class and then end up at Oxford. So she's done very well, but pull the ladder up. This is the language of Corbyn. Also, it comes on the back of, by the way, you say about the MPs not being in the House of Commons, this Chagos Islands giveaway. the timing of which seems to me to be bizarre in extremis. It's now necessitated a vote in the House because MPs are rightly complaining that they weren't consulted. We've got this mood music still around the budget, which frankly we're all waiting far too long for. I mean, you predicted this. Every day is going to be filled between the conference and October the 30th with conversations about how bad the budget is going to be. We've now got Rachel Reeves flirting with the idea of changing the law to allow Labour to borrow 50 billion quid. Got Ed Miliband once again on the world stage in his unique, once again on the world stage, kind of advocating his frankly unique brand of eco-zealotry, which is going to cost us all billions. Anecdotally, I've heard actually over the course of the last week quite a few people running small businesses saying, I'm really worried. Genuinely, I've heard those people say that.
I think after each election, you should have a budget quickly. After 97, 2010, 2015, even going back to 1979, a budget was had much more quickly by the incoming government. Because before you have your budget, you cannot set the tone of your government. And now, as you say, lots of businesses are waiting before they do anything because they're waiting for the budget.
I must say I'm taking a little bit of satisfaction from all of those lefty commentators who were hailing the stability that a Labour landslide would bring. Do you remember the likes of Andrew Marr and Alistair Campbell and all those people saying, oh, thank goodness we have sensible government back? Oh dear.
What do you think, Camilla, this means for the Conservatives? We've got their leadership will come down to the final two this week. We'll be covering that tomorrow and the following day, the two key votes. Is this helpful for them? I wrote today that this had to be helpful. There was a glimmer now for the Conservatives to see a route back, which I don't think they could have imagined would come this quickly.
Whisper it, Kamal. Are the Conservatives on the brink of an extraordinary comeback?
You knew it would come true, your column in the end.
Well, eventually. But the trouble is, of course, it's happened at the beginning of Labour's administration.
Yes, and
we've
got
still got
4
more years to repair the damage, and maybe they'll learn a few things from this complete farrago. Interestingly, just on leadership, and as you say, we're going to be across it all week, one of the leadership candidates, who I won't name, is telling me it is super tight at the top. We had this interesting Con Home poll, which seemed to put James Cleverly ahead of Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, which surprised people. The reaction to his conference speech seems to be very positive. I personally thought it was a little bit like a sort of rugby club initiation ceremony. I didn't quite get the appeal myself. We've got Tom Tugendhat, Andrew Mitchell, the shadow foreign minister, came forward yesterday and said we need to get him into the final two because they want a righty and a one-nationer on the ballot paper. But I think it is a bit, despite all this going on for Labour and wonderful, and we can bask in their demise, at the same time, I think the Tory leadership, first of all, isn't necessarily registering with the public at all. And second of all, they're all a bit nervous. I don't know how this is going to go, which makes it quite exciting.
We're going to see till the end of the year. We've got the big investment summit next week for the Labour government. We've got the budget. Those are going to be the two markers. And also, what do they do about this whole problem of worklessness? I think those are the three big things we now need to watch for and analyse over the next 3 months to see if these changes at the centre, Sue Gray going, Morgan McSweeney being given much, much more power, actually work for Keir Starmer. He can't afford many more missteps.
Coming up next, today marks the first anniversary of the October the 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel. We will hear from relatives of hostages who have been released, as well as another who is still in captivity 1 year on. The testimony we are going to hear from a father reunited with his wife and 3 children is really quite something, and certainly worth holding on to listen to.
7th of October 2023, a day that shall be remembered in infamy, where thousands of cruel terrorists broke into our homes, violated our families, burned, chopped, raped, and hijacked and abducted our citizens, our brothers and sisters, and with them, people from 36 different nationalities. This is a scar on humanity. This is a scar on the face of the earth.
That was the Israeli President Isaac Herzog at a commemoration this morning on the 1-year anniversary of the October the 7th attacks by Hamas. The worst terrorist atrocity on Israeli soil. Hamas murdered almost 1,200 people, raped and tortured others, and kidnapped 250 men, women and children. 97 of the hostages are yet to be accounted for. Some have been freed by the Israeli Defense Force, others released, and others murdered. For families and loved ones of those still imprisoned, the wait goes on. Since that appalling day, war has raged in the region. Israel has vowed to eliminate Hamas and is also seeking to secure its northern border against attacks from Hezbollah, the Iran-backed terror group. Tens of thousands of civilians have died, the vast majority in the Palestinian territory of Gaza, which Hamas controls.
Well, today we will hear from Israelis whose lives were changed forever on October the 7th. We are just going to give you a content warning here. What you're about to hear is distressing. Let's begin with Aviva Siegel. Aviva and her husband Keith were taken hostage in Gaza after their kibbutz, Kfar Aza, was invaded by around 300 terrorists. Aviva was released after 51 days during a ceasefire, but Keith remains a hostage. Here she recounts her experience of being held prisoner in Gaza, beginning with the first moments of that October the 7th atrocity.
So Keith and I were sitting in the shelter, and then one of my daughters, Shir, she wrote to us, "You're the strongest people in the world." And by listening to that sentence, I understood that something really bad is happening on Kfar Aza. And while I was in Gaza, I used to remember that sentence. It gave me strength, but on Kibbutz Kfar Aza, while I was sitting in the shelter, I understood that something really bad is happening from that sentence. That's the only thing that they said. One of the daughters said that we must keep in touch with her all the time, that she's very worried. Yeah. But nobody told us what's happening. So we were sitting in the shelter and we heard the shooting coming closer and closer, and then them shooting the house. And then I remember hearing the steps next to the door of our little shelter, and looking at Keith, shaking. Both of us were shaking. And we were very quiet because we were scared that they would know that we're there. And then they just opened the door and they pushed themselves in. About 15 terrorists tried to shove themselves in. I remember looking at them, and they were like faces trying to put themselves in to see who they caught. And what saved our lives was Keith put his head on his knees and his hands on his head. So they didn't kill us, but they did shoot us. And one of the bullets hit Keith. And when we arrived to Gaza, we saw lots of people, families, children, older people, all age that you can think of. Everybody was standing outside to welcome us, with shooting in the air, screaming Allahu Akbar, happy. It was a party for them, while Keith and I wanted to die, shaking. We didn't understand what's happening to us. And I remember trying to figure out, what am I doing in Gaza? How come I'm in Gaza? I was in my house and they took me with my pajamas. So we arrived to Gaza and they took us down. In the house that they brought us to, you did 4 steps and there was a pier, like a hole to go down underneath the ground. And I'll never forget the terrorist at the bottom, smiling, happy as can be, telling me, come, and come quickly down. I was shaking while the ladder was shaking with me, because I'm very, very scared of everything. And Keith wasn't able to even relax me. And after that, they moved us. Keith and I were moved 13 times in Gaza, the period of time that I was there. Of the 7 weeks and 2 days, that's 51 days. With lots and lots of very, very mean terrorists that were very, very brutal to us all the time. We didn't have any human rights at all. Everything was taken away from us. We weren't allowed to feel. We weren't allowed to cry. We weren't allowed to hug. We weren't allowed to talk. We weren't allowed, we were starved. I lost 10 kilos and I was dehydrated most of the time. A lot of times there was no water at all for us to drink.
Next, we can hear from Yifat Zayla, whose cousin Shiri and her two young sons, Kafir and Ariel, were kidnapped on October the 7th. The next month, Hamas claimed all three had been killed, but their deaths have not been confirmed. Yifat is still fighting for her cousin's return, hopeful that one day the family will be reunited.
It's like it's been a roller coaster. A lot of moments of hope that I'm gonna see my loved ones again, and then moments of despair and great sadness when hearing about other hostages being killed. I lost my aunt and uncle on October 7, and next month it will mark, a year since that day. And I never started mourning and saying goodbye, even because I'm so invested in trying to see what more I can do, what more can we do as family to raise awareness of our story about Shiri, Arden, Kfir and Ariel. To say that I'm tired is the obvious. I'm exhausted. I'm terrified. I can't believe that it's been 11 months now. I really can't believe it. The last 2 weeks has been really a nightmare. The 6 hostages that were killed and shot in the head and returned for burial. They're not my family, but by now, all the hostages, I feel like and all their families, we are one big family here. I'm terrified for my family's faith and if they're alive and if they're not, we don't know anything. And the not knowing is also, I feel like in some sort of a very cruel reality show. Who's gonna be next? Who's gonna Hamas execute next? Who's the next family is gonna break down and stop counting the days?
Finally, let's hear from Avichai Brodach, whose wife and 3 children were taken hostage by Hamas from their homes in Kfar Azar kibbutz. Avichai then stood outside the defense ministry in Tel Aviv nearly every day, hoping to pressurize the government into bringing a ceasefire so the hostages could be released. His wife Hagar, their daughter Ofri, and sons Yuval and Oria, aged 10, 8 and 5, were freed after 51 days. Here, Avichai remembers the moment he was reunited with his family.
I knew Hamas had a big reality show for us. They didn't tell us who's coming. We knew every day 10 or 12 or 14 hostages were going to return, but we had to wait to get the list from Hamas. So on the first day, which was the 49th day, I got a phone call late in the evening that they're not on the list. And I didn't even know if they were alive. And I waited another day and I got the same phone call. This time it was much later in the night. And then on the third day, on the 51st day, it was about 2 a.m. I got the phone call from my connection to the army, and she told me that my family's on the list. And you can imagine that I couldn't fall asleep. I just waited for them. It was just incredible news to know you're going to get your family back in just a few hours. We all went friends to Kfar Aza. We brought whatever we could think of in the car from our house in Kfar Aza, dolls and pillows, whatever things that I thought they would like. brought them all over to Schneider Hospital. My car was packed with just everything I could think of. And I stood there in Schneider with, doctors and nurses waiting for them. And they came with a helicopter. I think it was 10 in the evening. And then, I always say, I had 3 miracles in my life. And the first one was that I survived. My second miracle was when I got the news that they were kidnapped and not slaughtered, because I was sure that they were slaughtered on the first day. It took just more than 24 hours for the news to arrive. And that was my second miracle, that I got the news. And the third miracle, the Schneider Hospital, the landing pad is on the ground floor, and the ward where I was waiting for them is on the second floor, I think. And I had to wait by the elevator. They went through, and then the door opened, and my daughter comes out, Ofri, and this is just unbelievable because, I remember her being born, obviously. I was there, and that's a miracle. And this time, the elevator door opens, and I get my daughter running at me. And then I get my son, and then my other son, and then Hagar comes. And they were, my Ofri and Yuval and Uriah were smiling, just, you couldn't imagine what kind of smile. It was just happiness. And Hagar came out crying, until that day, until November 26th, on the evening when she got out of Gaza with the Red Cross. She was sure that I was dead. And they told her on that day that I survived. So, for 51 days, she thought that I was dead. And she just, was so overwhelming. She just burst out crying. And, but I got them all back, and I got 4 miracles in one on that day.
Extraordinary testimony and an extremely poignant day, not only in Israel, but all around the world, as we remember the victims of October the 7th. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m.